we're going to extend our work to include the other senses that we haven't dealt with. The senses of seeing, smelling, and tasting. Just as we do with hearing, when we have an experience of seeing, smelling, or tasting, we simply note it, seeing, smelling, or tasting, regardless of what it is. The four senses of hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting differ from all those varieties of body sense that we talked about. They're not ingrained in our being in the same way in which the body senses are. It's like they touch us from outside or impinge on us in some way. So our experience is simply one of that sense. People really differ in the extent to which they get visual imagery, which can be actual scenes of things, can be variations of color and lightness and darkness, sometimes can be various geometric symbols, sometimes can just be a sense of movement in front of the eyes. There's a wide variety of visual experiences that we can have. When they occur and draw our attention away from the breath, we simply note them as seeing, no matter what they are. If they continue, we continue to note them, repeating the note every 5 to 10 seconds and returning to the breath again after a minute or two. It's important when we're engaged in paying attention to any of these sensory experiences that we're not just noting it and being aware that the experience is going on, but that we're also watching what is happening. In the same way, as I told you when you're watching the breath, to be aware of all the changing pattern of sensations across the length of the breath. We want to be aware of changes in the quality of any other body sensation that we're working with across the time we watch it. We want to be aware of change and fluctuation in our experiences of hearing, seeing, smelling, and tasting, because there will be change across that experience as we're noting it and watching it. And the mindfulness has to be sharp enough that it goes beyond just knowing that that experience is occurring, but that it watches and sees, experiences, knows what is happening across the length of the experience for the period of time that we're watching it. So if you're having a changing visual pattern and you're noting it as seeing, be aware of what's happening, what movement or change or whatever's going on. You don't note all of these things. You simply note seeing, but you watch what's happening. Some people have virtually no visual experience. If you're not having any visual experience, that's nothing to be concerned about. There are just wide individual differences in that regard. There are also wide individual differences in the extent to which people have hearing experiences that seem to come from interior stimulation rather than an exterior noise impinging on them, or experiences of taste and smell coming up that there's no apparent reason why they should occur. Some people get alarmed when they start having sensory experiences that they can't pin on some cause in the environment. That's nothing to be alarmed about. It's one way that our psyche can communicate with our psyche. In other words, it's a way that we can communicate to ourselves, and we do it every night when we dream. We communicate to ourselves that way. We create experiences that we then experience, and a dream, you know, can be very real. We experience it as if it were something in reality out there. It's important to understand that this is perfectly okay, because many of us associate the idea of having sensory experiences that we can't see as caused by something outside of us as being pathological in some way. While it's true that these kind of experiences also occur in some forms of psychopathology, they're a very natural activity of the mind under certain conditions. And one of those conditions is the kind of stillness and depth that we're cultivating. It's just one other way that we can communicate with ourselves, that we can experience whatever is rising up. It can take the form of thought. It can take the form of images, or tastes, or smells, or sounds. It can take a variety of forms, and it's nothing to be alarmed about when that happens. In fact, I could virtually guarantee you, if you do enough of this practice in enough depth, eventually you will have sensory experiences that can't be traced to something external. It's also important that you don't try to figure out where a sensory experience is coming from. That gets you off into thinking and analyzing, and then you're no longer meditating. The question of whether it arises from something in the external environment or whether it's internally generated is a moot question in this practice, just an unimportant question. It's even a doesn't make sense question in this practice. So please drop all concerns about trying to get into that kind of an activity either, of figuring out where it comes from. You work with, as I explained with seeing, you also work with smelling and tasting in the same way in which you work with hearing and seeing. If you become aware that your attention has been drawn to one of those sensory experiences, note it as hearing, seeing, smelling, or tasting. If the experience continues, repeat the note after 5 to 10 seconds. After a minute or two, return to the breath, or if the experience ends earlier, return to the breath, or if your mind wanders from the experience to something else, return to the breath. There's also something else that I want to add to the practice this morning besides working with these other sensory experiences, and that has to do with your work throughout the day. It's time in the retreat to tighten up a little bit on those in-between times, the times when you're neither walking or sitting. I've already suggested to you that it would be very helpful as you walk around the place to note the movements of your legs and to have yourself aware of the sensations that are occurring in your legs. I would like to suggest that we extend that awareness to our arms and our hands now. There are many times during the day when you lift your arm to reach for something. Every time you go to your room, you're reaching for your knob, you're grabbing the knob, you're turning, you're pushing the door open, and you go through a reverse kind of operation when you close the door behind you. To start to bring your awareness to those kinds of movements, to the movements when you're taking your shower, of the reaching for soap, taking the soap, moving up and down arms and other body parts as you're lathering yourself with the soap, to note the movements, and if as you're lathering yourself, you could note up, down, if that feels best, or you could note rubbing, or the sense of touch, or smoothness, or softness, if that's the quality of that experience that impinges most strongly on you. But start trying now to incorporate the movements of your hands and arms into your noting. With all of these movements that we make throughout the day, we deal with them the same way we deal with the movements in walking. We note the movement, usually. Sometimes we can note the quality of the experience, though, as I said, with the soap, if the smoothness really stands out rather than the up-down motion. But for the most part, we'll be noting things like the reaching, turning movements that we make with our hands and arms. We note the movement. We try to be paying attention to the sensations that we experience as we're doing that. Extending the mindful awareness into all of these other kinds of actions that we do gives both our concentration and our mindful awareness a tremendous boost. If you haven't already figured it out, before the end of the week, we're hoping to have you so that absolutely nothing you do or experience escapes the mindful awareness. It won't necessarily be terribly fine-grained. Across the length of a long retreat, this awareness gets more and more fine-grained, down to even very, very small, minute things. But at least in some kind of global fashion, we will want absolutely everything you do or experience to have become part of the practice. Let's sit. As you establish your posture, try to sit so that the bones just stack themselves up on top of each other. Shoulders over your hip bone. Check to be sure that the shoulders are loose and relaxed, not bunched up tightly around the neck. Be sure that your head is not hanging forward over your chest or thrust forward, that it's back in line with the shoulders and the hip bone. Slightly tucking the chin often helps with this. Draw your awareness to the place where you watch the breath, being inside the sensations of the breath, adding your note of in and out or rising, falling as soon as you become aware that an inhalation and exhalation has started. Try to catch the very first instant of awareness of the experience. If you find yourself thinking, note thinking, see the thought die, go back to the breath. If you become aware of an experience of hearing, seeing, smelling, or tasting that draws your attention away from the breath, then let your awareness rest in that experience that your mind has gone to. When the experience ends, go back to the breath, or if your attention wanders from it, go back to the breath. While it continues, repeat your note of hearing, seeing, smelling, or tasting about every 5 to 10 seconds. After a minute or two, choose to return to the breath. If the same experience draws your attention away again, you can go out and work with it again for a period of a couple of minutes. If a body sensation of any kind draws your awareness away from the breath, find a word that describes the quality of that sensation, be it a sensation of motion or temperature change or touch contact, whatever kind of body experience. Find a note that describes the quality of it, but don't look over hard trying to find just the right word. Try to make your noting hit the first awareness that you have that your attention is resting in that experience. If the experience ends or your mind wanders from it, go back to the breath. If the body experience continues, repeat your note every 5 to 10 seconds, and then after a minute or two, return to the breath. Try to sit without moving. If an impulse to move comes, see if you can settle back into being with your experience. But don't get into any fighting or coercion. When you reach the limits of your willingness, it's time to move and then go back to the breath and begin again. And to do this without any self-blame or impatience or judgment of yourself. If you do move during the sitting, be alert to note that movement. If it involves sliding a leg or lifting an arm or churning a shoulder, note the movements that you make during the sitting if you move. Be very aware. When you hear the sound of the bell, note hearing and put all of your attention on that experience. Okay. Work hard,